Hello and good morning, everybody. How y'all doing? This is Jeremiah, and we have another great webinar in store for you on SketchUp. Getting into almost the intermediates. If it's a part two of basics, you can consider yourself now at an intermediate level. That's what I'm going to say. Hey, a couple quick housekeeping items for you watching. At the top of the screen, you can go into that view options and exit the full screen mode. I like to do that if I need to get to something else during the webinar. But also do please familiarize yourself with the Q&A button there in the upper left. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of good questions, and that will get in and we'll get them, answered as quick as possible and queued up for Jake, and be sure to get all your questions answered. So don't be shy about typing in any old question at all, and just do keep your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat window, please. You're welcome to chat to others in there, but we like to keep all the questions in the question box. Makes sense. And of course, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch this again and again. Should be up on the website probably later today, but give us until Monday to be sure to get that up on the website, ready for you to watch. I think I have babbled enough here. I'm sure Jake is tapping his toes and fingers, so get this handed right over to Jake.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jer. Welcome everybody. I'm actually really excited to do part two of this basics, we'll call it. But again, as Jer said, this is going to start creeping into some intermediate stuff. So we'll definitely try to answer any questions that you've got on a simplistic level. But again, any questions are welcome. So definitely pay attention because it is going to be riveting stuff here. So what we want to kind of go over really is a little bit deeper into the faces, the surfaces, and the lines. Again, just talking about drafting techniques as we start getting going into SketchUp. If you've watched the initial basics SketchUp webinar, that went into just tools and some of the basics of how SketchUp works, but really getting into some drafting techniques as you start going definitely will ease the frustration level as you don't understand how certain things work. But again, getting into even a couple other little hidden items when you right click on certain things, want to sort of touch on those. And then a basic intro to the dialog boxes that you're going to use on a daily basis. This is really going to start, sending you to the next level from how you modify and edit and keep things organized and that kind of stuff. So really getting into that. And then I wanted to kind of change the tone a little bit and actually show off some of the materials features. We won't go super deep into everything, but I thought it would be fun to actually create your own texture. Some people might have photos that they want to use in SketchUp. So how we do that, that's where it starts getting into the intermediate part, I'll say. And then really some of the hidden features within the already existing tools. So mainly focusing on the move and rotate tool, and then even the scale and tape measure tool. All these are going to actually help with the creation of the content that you do have done in SketchUp. So just taking those tools and making it easier for you to work. And then obviously we want to end with really understanding components and groups, how they work, when you should use them, that kind of stuff. So just one more reminder, resources available. Do not be afraid of going to YouTube for SketchUp. That's how I learned it. But there are so many different great resources. So just a reminder to everybody that we'll have these links actually on the recorded version on our page, but all of the documentation that we have on our website, along with a lot of YouTube and Daniel Tall links and again, being patient with our good friend Bob Wiley, baby steps. So if you don't understand it, search it, ask people. There's a lot of community stuff out there. As I was digging through old stuff, I did find this little beauty that we'll make sure exists as well for you to use. It's not out of date that it's not relevant, but it's got some really cool key pieces of information as a resource as you're looking through what your left click and right click and middle wheel does, along with some of the basic tools here. So just wanting to have that available for people as they start out, as well as the other resources. It's going to be great. So really, we could end it there and be done, but obviously we are going to go into the actual program here. So as we get going here, we want to understand that obviously SketchUp has several drop downs that is going to help with navigation and what you're going to be doing here. The basics of having, and I guess I should clarify too, I'm in Mac SketchUp, so if things look a little different, that is why. Everything is basically the same, just in a couple different areas, but going to preferences, being able to set your templates and your shortcuts and the file, that kind of settings, definitely something to get familiar with. We kind of touched on that in the basics one, but just understanding that that's kind of the key, the heart of how you're going to be doing stuff here. So I'm also using SketchUp Pro, which is definitely recommended, but we're going to basically bring in some line work here because I want to just sort of go over some of the drafting techniques here now. So if we were to go and import, we have the ability to import basically from any style of these accepted files here. This is in SketchUp Pro, but I can actually add a DWG here. I'm just going to grab this base file and import him. And what SketchUp's going to do is it's going to give you this import result, give you kind of a breakdown of what it brought in, and it's going to set it down where basically at its insertion point of 0, 0 here at the crosshairs of this axis is the origin point, and that's where this file kind of lives. Now, this is just simply line work. So I can actually, if I rotate around it, you can see that I can kind of see through it. So nothing is made from a face standpoint. And some of these key settings that I'm going to go over next, really, really important as you start to draft, as you start to work with whether it's CAD-based layers or just your own drawing stuff from scratch, tracing over a photo or something like that. But it's super, super important that you have what we call profiles on. You can get to it a couple different ways. If you go to View and you go to Edge Style, there are all of these different options here. And profiles is going to be something that kind of puts your eye to a spot that isn't necessarily ready for a face, or it's not cut into the rest of the surface. So we'll kind of show you that in a second. The other place that we can get to it though is in our styles dropdown. So if we were to go into our window, and you can see that we have all of these different options here. You can see some of mine have little lines, some have check marks. The line just means that it's minimized. Check mark means that it's open, and nothing means that it's not actually activated or up on my screen. So these are the few that I like to have, and we'll actually just touch on this instructor first because he's a great little starter helper guy here. So what he does in this window, and you can keep him just up and off to the side if you want to, but as you move through different tools, so I hit M to get to my move tool, and you can see that he now has a little bit of a teaching guide for you. I hit L, and that's my line tool. And you can click and go to the SketchUp website and see all that kind of stuff. But this gives you a basic sense of how that tool is going to actually operate, which is really, really nice. So I don't personally have this up as much as I probably should in some of the tools that I use, but it's there definitely for help. So the instructor is a great one to have. But the other ones that we like to have, at least from a consistent standpoint, is our entity info, materials, and materials is a little bit different on the Mac side than it is on the Windows side. So I just keep him closed because he's a completely separate window or dialog box altogether for all my materials, but the same kind of theory applies with the Windows version there. So, but I really like the components dialog box. Here's the entity info. This is going to give you information on kind of anything that you select in the model. It'll tell you what it is and where it is layer wise and if it has definitions and that kind of stuff here. So additionally, layers is a great box to have out. And then again, styles. Styles is not only how the drawing looks, but it gives you those options from a edge standpoint, from the style standpoint, to maybe you've picked a template that has that sky and that background, and you're wondering how to change that color and or completely get rid of it. That is right there in the styles option, being able to pick a color and kind of go from that right there. But again, all in the styles box. Again, we're not going to get into too many of these details, but being able to throw a picture on the background of this model space. Or again, as you get into further tools, some of the section cut stuff, how those colors are lined out. So that's a great one just to have up for those kind of things there. So with that right there, I'm going to turn on our profile so we can kind of start seeing what I mean by it's important to have those things turned on. You can see that these lines are much darker than they were before. Here's with them off, here's with them on. And those profiles are going to help us kind of gauge what we need to still fill in, because all these still don't have faces to them. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw, and usually if the faces are actually connected, or the lines are connected, but it just doesn't have a face, usually you can draw over a line and it'll fill in. If you continue to get your rubber band, that means it didn't fill in. It's still open at some point. And this is really, really important to know, because it's going to take forever for you to try to trace this item and get it over the exact lines and stuff like that, versus just understanding, I'm just going to delete that line, that we were actually drawing on top of a group. Okay, and if we go ahead and we open up this entity info, you can see actually it's a component. Sorry, group or a component. Anything that's encased in one of these kind of holding cells, you're not going to be able to just draw and intersect on the line. And that's whether it's a curse or a blessing, that's the beauty of SketchUp. You can actually draw and cut into lines and section them off, but you might think that's how things are separated by layers, so that you can do things kind of on their own layers and have it work that way. Layers are actually a little bit misleading. Layers are actually used to manage geometry visibility. That is it. So even if you have things line work on certain layers, you can draw and still intersect and kind of mess up that stuff. So I'm going to double click inside of this component here, and now you can see that I can select any of these lines here. And this is where, if I draw a line, it filled in that face here. So that now is a face, and that can be used. I can draw another line, I can cut in and separate it that way, separate the faces this way. So knowing that, this is how, and you can actually see, if I were to finish drawing in, oops, follow my own stuff here, make sure we're in the model. And let's try to section off one of these guys. So drawing that line just filled in the rest of my curve there. And you see how the differences in the line weights are. Now from a cut surface and a filled in surface with a face versus an edge that belongs to an area that doesn't have a face. So that's the importance of that profile line. We're able to then identify exactly where we need to start looking, doing things. Now I've gone ahead and gone a little bit further here, but you can see that I have, if I go in here, I have cut in all my faces in all these different areas, but there is an area here with those darker lines, which means I don't have a face right here. There's nothing here. So how we get that cut in is, by drawing those lines. You can see here that I've got these dark edges, which means I've got faces here, but again, he falls within that realm. So how do we get that filled in? I'm not going to go into too many plugins at all, really, but there are commands where you can actually select areas, right-click, and make a face. But you can also just use that typical, let's find a place to start connecting and see what it fills in. So it looks like it filled that one in, and it actually looks like it filled this one in, because if you see that double kind of scratchy looking there, that means there's a face on top of a face. And you can tell that this dark line means that it didn't actually cut into this. So this is a solid surface here, but I've got a piece here. So even if I were to try to draw over this line, he actually was recognized again now, and he's cut in. His thicknesses went away, and now I know he's good. But you notice the difference in the color. And this is going to be a really, really important thing to just keep in mind. Whether you use the actual rendering softwares and that kind of stuff, it's going to play into the textures of stuff. So we have a white side and we have a blue side, and those are the defaults. But again, going into styles, you can actually come into your front and your back colors, and you can edit those to be whatever they want. I've read that some people, especially from a starting out standpoint, will change this to something kind of a crazy color, whether it's a really bright color or something way off, just so they understand that it's different. Its contrast is completely different, so they know it's on the back side. So the colored side is the back side, and the white side is the front side. And so why does that matter? And then how, obviously, do we fix that? So it matters in a couple respects. One, because it actually affects how the push-pull tool works. So we went over that tool last time, but if you type P, it'll bring you to your push-pull tool. And if I pull this guy up a certain distance, I can repeat that that command, that distance, by just double clicking. So if I double click, he pops him up the same distance as before. So really, really quickly, I can start bringing up the different spots that I want at that same distance. It's good for stairs and walls and all kinds of different things. But if I double click on a backside, you see how he dropped in instead? He dropped down because he's actually going the way that the face is facing. So it's really important to any of these backsides, they will all drop instead of raise up the way that they should. Okay, so it's kind of important just from a functional standpoint that you have everything colored properly there. So if I were to delete this face, you'll see that all of the inside of those edges are that yellow because that's the inside face, right? I could select one of those and I can right click on it. Here's again going into that right click option. I can reverse that face and it will swap it. So now the back side is on the outside and now my front's on the in. So if I were to pull that out and double click, they're gonna all go the wrong way. He'll keep popping out this way, but all of these guys would inset that way. So it should be the white on the outside, which means that's the texture side. That's the side that you should paint. Now, what happens if I actually paint all of this stuff? So let's just kind of go into one of these things, and I'm just picking a random color here. And we'll paint a couple of these walls just like that. And I'm going to put back this guy here so I can pull him up just a little bit more. So I've painted a bunch of these walls, right? But I also don't know which one was my front and which one's my back. You can go into your styles here and go into the monochrome setting and make sure I get that right one. Yeah, go into the monochrome setting and you'll notice that it will essentially be, it'll turn it back into the white versus the other one. And I actually click that brown as my back color so we can switch that back so that there we go. So that's what I want it to be. So that's with monochrome on. Okay. And if we turn it back to the textures, you can see that those guys turn back that color. So even if that texture was across all of these faces and I didn't know which side was what, I can turn it back to that monochrome and it'll tell me front face versus back face. So you can make the changes. I can switch these around. Now it might be a kind of a pain then to switch these. If I've got so many that are in the wrong position and stuff like that, how do I quickly start to flip these faces? I can right click on each one and I can reverse the face. I can right click on this one and I can reverse the face. Or I can right click on the face that I like and orient the faces, and it will actually orient all the faces to that specific position. Now you can see that I'm exactly how I want. However, I've reversed that. Now my inside's on my outside. So I'm going to reverse one face and I'm going to orient faces, and it's going to swap everything back out. So you can make really, really quick changes to whatever it is that you need simply by using that reverse face and orient face side of things. So again, the texture part is going to be a big issue, but once you start kicking it into a rendering software, they look for a front face and they look for a back face. And the rendering output will definitely get skewed and maybe the faces won't show up. Or something like that because it's looking at something that's on the inside instead of the outside. So I'm going to pause here just so I can get my composure for the next section. But Jared, are there any questions so far?
You've been handling it perfect, so no questions. If you do have questions, just again a reminder, that Q&A box, feel free to type in anything at all. If you do get a moment and you're not following along, we can definitely help you out with it. But keep on a going.
All right, cool. So now I want to kind of go over another concept here, just from a drafting standpoint. We've definitely got a lot of line work here that we can um, start building up and getting kind of prepped and stuff like that. But when you're drawing lines, you've kind of noticed these little dots and edges that keep pointing out. Maybe there's a spot, and we're just going to pop this building up a little bit here. And maybe there's a spot that you want to sort of section off into some even lines, whether that's from a door perspective or positioning windows or even just creating notch outs and whatnot. So again, it doesn't have to be applied to building standpoint, but just in general. The way SketchUp works, again, is this line is a solid stitched together line. But if I were to draw a line and sort of intersect it, it automatically cuts it into two lines. So we could essentially start, maybe drawing a line even along itself and type in, we'd have to figure out that total length there, and maybe we want to divide it into even sections or something like that, and I can click it there, and you'll notice that even drawing it on itself will cut it to that point. That way I have like this little endpoint gauge, so I know where exactly those lines end, so I can really quickly start dropping in lines there. So what I can do, instead of just drawing lines and trying to guess on it, or even drawing lines that I'm going to have to eventually delete out, because once I delete this line, because I don't need it, those lines get stitched back together. So that's not going to prove us very much benefit there. So I can right click, go into my model, I can right click on a line, and I can choose divide. And this is a really cool little tool, because as I slide to the left or to the right of that line or along that line, you can see down in the lower right the segments that it's going to create. I can type in the amount of segments that I want, but it tells you as I hover over it what length those are going to be. So I can quickly even just say segments 2 and divide it in half, or divide it into thirds, or whatever it is, and click, and now SketchUp has automatically cut that line into those segments. So it makes it really easy then, as I'm drawing, as I hover over this line and I drag across, it tells me where those endpoints are, and I can go ahead and drop something in there, or again, use the move tool, select a line, click a starting point, and hit your Control or Alt, and be able to make a copy of that line. So now I can drag this copy of that line and find the endpoint and put it in there, and we now have section cuts this way. All right, so just a fun little tool to kind of keep in mind is you have that divide option there to take that line and break them into as many pieces as you want. That's beneficial not only from a finding a line standpoint, but maybe you want to just move one section. And this is going to be a little trippy here because it's going to mess up the geometry, but maybe you wanted to bulb out one portion of this wall or something like that. Obviously, it would ruin the integrity of the flatness, the planarness of this roof there, but I can now start doing this to my walls, make it that much more interesting. I can drop this in here, and again, kind of fun to just play around with, but selecting a line, grabbing the move tool, and dragging it out. Now it's locked on this plane here, and it's glued on to where it is. But if I hit the arrow keys again, I can run it in the red axis, into the green axis, or even into the blue axis, and it locks it that way. So I'll just run it into the red axis, and you can see that it moves that line out and it moves those points. So really quickly you can start getting into a little bit of trouble there, but that's the kind of stuff that as you start playing around with it, gives you that sense of what you can do. For example, if we were to pull this up right here and we put a line on top of it, and we simply hover over this line and drag him in the blue direction, click the up arrow, you can see that it created that peak. So you can make shapes, you can alter the way that something looks just by moving a point or an entire line of an object. Again, it's gonna render the result maybe of what you wanted, maybe not. But again, we'll go ahead and we'll drop in, actually, I'm gonna make sure I go to the midpoint this time, and I'll go to the midpoint this way, and pulling up that point into the blue direction, and give yourself a pitched roof on all sides. So after that's done, if the face is planar, you can remove those guidelines, and now you have that kind of position there. So now when it comes to additional tools, obviously the way that things are drawn, maybe they are not stitched together like this, maybe on a curved surface, especially from a CAD perspective and stuff like that, you're going to not be able to offset single lines. And offset is simply by choosing the F key, or it's this little guy right here. But you can see if I hover over a line, it won't let me. But if I hover over an entire face, it will offset that entire sort of surface, or that shape there. So if it's a single arc, you can select several lines and use the offset, and it will offset that edge. But you have to have one or more lines to be able to do that. If it's a true arc, if I just grab, and let's just place this arc here, an arc will offset. So again, it might look like an arc, but it might be line segments. That's definitely something that you have to be sure of how it was drawn. And then again, if the shape doesn't allow the offset, it'll tell you that it just won't work. Obviously, it has to be within the raw geometry itself, not within a group, to be able to offset as well. So we're going to move right along. I think we've kind of done a number on those. The last one that I want to kind of touch on from a navigation standpoint and a face standpoint and a line standpoint is sometimes you might get a little far away from your geometry, or maybe it's somewhere else that you want to go directly. But you can select a line and right click on it and zoom to the selection. It's actually really nice because it points you right exactly to that width of that line or face or whatever it is. So really quickly you can move over to, let's say, this building here and zoom to that face. If you've had problems in the past trying to navigate around and it squirrels you around or whatever, just right click on something, zoom to selection, and keep going that way. So you're not scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. Makes it kind of nice. So we're going to kind of move on to another one of these dialog boxes here, is the layers. Now, the layers is something, and I'll show this in one of our final examples here, but the layers, again, are only used for geometry visibility states. It's not necessarily to keep things from sticking to each other. Because if you look at my entity info here, I have, this is on layer 0, and then I might have something that is on a curb layer, and then this one's on layer 0, but no matter what happens, all of those are stitched together still until I actually make a group or a component. So the general rule of thumb is you should always keep everything on layer 0. All your raw geometry should be on layer 0. Again, personal preference or just a preference style. You can leave the layers, in CAD to keep things organized that way and turn things off, but it's not going to help separate the stuff in your drawing. It's keep everything in layer 0. So, for example, all of this stuff is definitely showing that there's multiple layers there, but we'll go ahead and set this to layer 0, all of this, and I would essentially take what I want. So let's just say this content right here for this house, and I'm going to make it a component. Number one rule, give your component a name that is unique to what that is. We don't want component 1 and component 2 and component 3. It's definitely something that will help your organization down the road. So this is my utility shed. And also remember to set your axis kind of at a point where it's going to be nice and easy for you to insert another version of that down into the plan. And I'm going to go ahead and create it. So I've created this component. Now, if I move him, he moves completely off of the plan and does not take the line work with him, okay? That's the number one benefit, obviously, and the number one way to actually start keeping things separate, not by layers, but by actual groups and components. And once I've made this a component, I can then create a layer, and maybe this is my structures. And in my entity info, again, this is kind of the combination of all these dialog boxes is why I like to keep them open, because now I can manage my layers. I can go into my entity info of what I've selected, and I can choose that layer. Now he is on the proper layer. If I turn off my structures, he goes away. And the benefit of the layers, again, from a visibility standpoint, is the speed in which you can move around your project, especially when you get a lot of stuff going on. And we'll hit that in the last little example here. So we're going to move on, unless there was any other questions.
No, once again, you've covered them all. But people feel free to type in some questions if you got them.
Type in the questions, guys. I think they'll start coming here in just a little bit. So we're going to move on to some image stuff, okay? And I'm going to couple this first example with creating a component. And we've created one component. It was just a standalone structure there. It was just made of line work. But I'm going to bring in an image. So if we go ahead and import, and I'm going to come back over to my guys here. I've got just a bunch of different images and materials that I've got here, but I also have, I forgot where I put it here. I'm actually going to do this one. This one's kind of fun. So we're just going to make, and again, not respective to landscape architecture by any means, but obviously making sure that the right file format is selected there. But we're going to go ahead and drop in this image. Now, I should also do it the right way here. So we're going to import, and you have a couple different options. One uses texture, uses an image, and then a match photo. We're not going to really go into that one. That one's pretty technical there. But we're going to use it as an image this time. Because as you can imagine, an image is strictly almost a photo that you can hang on a wall. A texture would be something that would attach to your wall like a wallpaper. So we'll go ahead and import this guy, and you'll place him in and scale him up. So now you can see, here's my cool VCR. I know everybody has one. So go take a picture of it and try this little example. If you don't have one, I can provide this image for you. So anyways, this is just essentially a component there, but it's an image. It's just a file that you can't really do anything with until you actually explode it. You know, if I try to draw on it, it'll act like a group or a component. But if I explode it, he will kind of turn into a texture. Okay, so now he's a texture on a face with edges, essentially something that we can manipulate and really even now draw on. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and basically trace where he is there. And you can see that now he's sort of cut out. I can actually delete those outer lines, and I'm kind of left with that original thing here. So obviously he's doesn't look like much of a VCR, right? And we're just going to move him to the origin point. And I'm going to use my rotate tool by hitting Q. And if I just click once, it sets down that position so that I can find where my first rotation point is and go. But if I click and hold and drag in any one of these axes, he actually changes to a different way that I can rotate this guy. So I actually want to rotate him up so that he's in the blue direction. So I'm going to put him in the red axis, and then I'm going to grab this first top corner here, and I'm going to drag him up to the blue position there. So now he's technically in the right direction, right? So now I really need to size this guy. I'm assuming he's going to be roughly a foot in the width standpoint. So if I grab my tape measure, and again, we could try to do this sort of the hard way and the old way, but like I'm measuring it here at 34 feet. So he's a little bit too big. I can click from dot, or so the corner to the corner, and look at my bottom kind of command line there, and it'll let you change that size. So I'm just going to type 1 foot and hit enter. And it asks you if you want to resize that model. You say yes, and now he is the right size. He's now going to be 1 foot wide. And we can confirm that the height is right, 2 inches tall, okay. Maybe he needs to be a little bit bigger. So maybe we actually move this top line up, you know, on the blue axis by 1 inch. So that's how big he is. Well, now my picture doesn't actually fit. So I'm actually going to right click. Again, if I select one of these faces and I right click, I now have an option for a texture, and I can position that guy. And if I position him, you can see he's got these little pins, and I can right click and I can unfix those pins, and they turn into just sort of these generic guys here. And if I click once, it picks it up, and I can click it again on the position of the photo that I want, and we'll sort of get these anchor points down here, and we'll zoom back in. And once I get it fine-tuned to right where I want it, I can click and drag and hook it up to where I want that to be. So I want that guy to be right there. I can grab this guy here. He wasn't refined very well, so I'll grab it right there. No, right here. And now if I rotate as I'm still in this model, it sort of goes away so I can preview it. And that looks pretty good, so we'll say done. Now he is right and ready for me, but obviously he is just a flat guy. So we're gonna grab the push-pull tool, and I'm gonna hit Alt so that it gives me this option. So these are the kind of hidden options that we want to have. It leaves the face there, but it also grabs and it pulls out this way. So we'll go ahead and we'll go 1.5 feet. It's a pretty big one, huh? So before I make the final change, I can go ahead and I can kind of redo that. I can say 1 foot, it'll shrink in. Maybe it's 8 inches. So I can really start to fine tune what that actually does. So now obviously he's got all kinds of weird things going on the image side of things, but we can then go ahead and do that same type of thing. We can import, not use as an image, but use as a texture. And I've got all these other ones. So here's a top version. So if we import him, we can just drag him out and just place him on there for now. Again, right click. We'll not project him. And position him. Grab the corners. Just like that. And you can just start taking real photos and making components. Okay, so I'm not going to finish that one just from a time perspective there, but you can get the sense there that this is how we can really start making just fun little things, whether it's components there or actual components that you can use in your landscape, right? So I'm going to bump over to this one now. And just show you, this is actually a little school project that we had to do, is go around campus and put textures on buildings. So same thing applied. I just went out, took pictures, and used those as textures on the building there. And if I were to right click on any one of those and position, you can see that that was the image, and just really aligning those up to the height of the building. What kind of makes it cool is once I've got that picture in there, we can go ahead and then start drawing on that picture. And if we pick, obviously a spot, maybe there to there, and maybe there to there. Erase that guy here. We can actually start popping this stuff out and making it 3D. Now it's just replicating the image there. So we have, again, a couple options. Texture, make it projected. And what projected is going to do is it's going to sort of slide those pixels from what it finds on those edges, and it'll essentially just respect those colors and not repeat that command. So maybe that I actually wanted that white and that line more than anything there. So we'll go ahead and just do that. So if I have this guy as projected and I use my push-pull, you can see that he kind of has that look to being that full picture, even though that picture is not there. So it just really makes it fun to start playing with these photos, being able to come to a door setting and actually pop it in, so that as you turn on your shadows and stuff like that, you can start to play with how those faces interact and stuff like that. Questions before we move on to some making of our own textures?
We did have a good question on, if you know any resources for, downloadable good free textures. And wanted to remind everyone, we do have a SketchUp resources webpage, which will be linked to from the recorded webinar. And we're going to make sure we have some good material download sites on that page, and also some of the plugins that have answered some of the other questions. So just definitely reminding people that a lot of these deeper answers will be all available on our SketchUp resources page.
Yep, cool. And yeah, if you were just to literally Google seamless textures, there was actually quite a few that I found, but I'm hoping in showing this that you'll actually find it to be actually pretty easy. And again, depending on the image that you use. So it all comes down to that, the quality, but again, the size of the image that is used as a texture does affect the size of the file for the SketchUp. So find one that is relatively small but good enough quality to show what you're wanting there. So we'll do a really quick version of this guy and a really quick version of this guy here to make a seamless texture. So the main thing to remember is to have a good enough quality there, but we're going to crop this picture, and we want to be able to crop it into a 1-to-1 ratio, just so that it's square. We want to make sure that it's got an even kind of look to it. So whatever that square is, position it to what might look the best. But this one's a little tricky because we've got some darker and we got some fuzzed out stuff. So it depending on the picture, will depend on how much sort of photoshopping and sort of cleanup that you do. So I'm going to dodge this side a little bit more to kind of match up with the rest of the lightness there, just so it doesn't look like it has that weird vignetting there. But you could go through and you could sharpen this up a little bit more in certain areas so that it loses that blur, but hopefully we can get a photo that doesn't have that. Once we have that done, you can go up to your image and just to see what the canvas size is here. And just working in pixels, I can see that it's 3243. So if I am trying to cut this directly in half, I'm going to just personally go to something that is easier to cut in half. So we're just going to crop this guy back down to 3000 pixels instead. It's going to crop it a little bit, but that's okay for our purposes. Once I've got this done, I'm going to go up to my filters, and I'm going to go to other, and I'm going to go to offset. And what offset's going to do is it's going to give me an option. It's literally going to kind of flip from a horizontal and a vertical perspective. So we want to go 1500 so that it's right in the middle of the horizontal, and we want to go 1500 right in the middle of the vertical. And it kind of looks like a weird picture now, but that's what we want it to look like. And if we can get a picture that has relatively easy stitching together, that's going to be best. But from this point, what this did is it allows these edges to really match together and make it look like it's a full image. So we just want to clean up the middle here so it doesn't look too terribly bad. So I'm just going to grab my my clone tool. I'm going to pick a part in this tree here, and I'm going to kind of wave it around. And again, bringing the hardness down so that it's not super rough on the edges, but just blending this in as well as possible. You might have to use a couple other tools here, but maybe just squiggly it out a little bit so that it kind of blends in. So if you were to just take a step back, that actually looks decent. We could also do a little bit in the fuzzy area just so that we get rid of some of that, but really making it so that there's no prominent spots that would be sort of ID the cloned portion of this here. So that looks pretty good. We might as well just hurry and do this antique wood one because he's going to be a little bit different. So we'll do the same thing, 1-to-1. Crop that guy just right there. It looks pretty good. And this is where it gets tricky, right, with the bigger grains there to the smaller. But let's just see what he is. From a pixel standpoint, 2000, that works great. So we're going to throw that filter on there. And we're going to go 1000 to 1000. And you can see that he's going to be way harder to stitch together and make it look seamless. So I'm going to show you one other trick. We're going to make a copy, Control J, or Option J there to make a copy or drag it down to that page. And I'm going to transform this, Control T. I'm going to right click and I'm going to flip it horizontally, and I'm going to flip it vertically. Accept that, hitting enter, and then I'm going to change his opacity down to 50 or 40 or 30, somewhere in there. So you can kind of see both. It's almost like a blended version, but it kind of evens it out from a standpoint. So again, depending on the picture, depending on if you're able to do something like that, we can then merge these layers by Control E. And let's go ahead and throw that filter on there one more time. And you can see that he's much closer to be able to stitch together. So good enough for this. We'll grab our clone tool and we'll kind of squiggly him down. Squiggly him down like that. So really quickly, this starts to look pretty good. You might want to touch up on some of those little flaws in the wood so that it doesn't look super repetitive with that one single flaw, but that's good enough for our point here. And we'll just save these images, okay? Once those are saved, we can actually start applying these things. So here's some fun little trees that I made with that texture, but we'll go ahead and drop one of those in. So obviously a circle is just made up of a bunch of little edges. These are our flat surfaces right here. So we're going to File, Import, and we're going to use as a texture here, but we're going to go back into our stuff here, and we've got our tree bark textures that we did, and we'll use it as a texture. So we'll import him, and we'll just essentially place it on there like this. Now, this is where we just got to figure out, position that guy. We will fix those pins, and now I have the option to kind of scale this up and down. So I can kind of get a sense of how big that tree maybe is, how big that bark is going to be. And we will say done. And if he is projected, and you just might have to play around with the projected versus not, but I can actually apply this to the whole thing. You can see once it gets around that curve, he starts projecting. So projected might not have been the best way. So let's just uncheck projected. We will take a sample of that and let's put it on everything. And you can see that it essentially stitches that whole thing up together. And obviously it's not supposed to be up at the top. So we just need to put one more texture here. And let's go back. And let's bring that tree rings picture in. And I could have photoshopped this a little bit so that it was a little bit cleaner or whatever, but again, being able to position this, put those pins right down near where that image is that you want. Let's just drag it up, sort of position him as close as possible. And then let's say done. So he looks pretty good, but he's just a circle. To give it a little bit more variety, we'll call it, I'm going to grab my freehand tool. It's just a little squiggly guy here. And I'm just going to kind of trace roughly. It's going to give it a sense of roughness, coarseness, whatever. And we're just going to push this guy down. Now, obviously, he kept the texture there, which is not good, but we can just grab whatever textures we have in our model and we can apply it there. And I'm going to uncheck hidden geometry so that I can apply it to the whole surface without having to do it per one. But you can see now, there's my cool little log. And if you were to turn on the shadows, those shadows again would be, and I'll actually just bring up the shadows dialog now. There he is. He's down here for some reason. And we can start to see that cool play on those textures and stuff like that way. So I know we are basically out of time, so I'm going to do one last thing here and kind of tie it all together. So being able to modify and keep things separate. This is a kind of a bigger file because of the textures that we're using here. The tree components are very, very high polylined and that kind of stuff. But to be able to properly layer this stuff is going to be just as sort of as the following here. So you can actually have nested layers, and this is what gives you the power here of being able to just turn off all of my plants altogether so that I can quickly move around. Or maybe I want to just turn off trees and leave the shrubs, or just leave the shrubs, or just leave the trees and not the shrubs. But this is all done by grouping. And groups essentially is going to be the best thing to use if you're not replicating the same thing over and over. If it's just a one-time item in the plan, so holding all the trees together, that should be a group. And I can go inside of that group and I can click on one of these guys here. And if we look at my entity info, he's on a tree layer. So within this, this main group, he is on their own tree layer. And everything within that component has their own different things, and everything from a raw material standpoint should be on layer 0. So really understanding that as we build up and consolidate and hold items together, we want this guy to be a component so that if I make one change to him, and maybe it is that I change a part of this cell, it changes everything in that plan. So that's where a component is used. And we ran out of time here today, so I think in our next intermediate, we'll definitely get into deeper stuff. But Jer, if there's any other questions?
Nope, we were able to get all the questions answered. So we're just reminding everyone that, of course, this was recorded, and it'll also link to additional SketchUp resources that have come up in answering questions. And so other than that, just wishing everyone a great weekend.